A glass of water turns dark green, not tea-colored or diluted like a typical drink, but dense, almost alive, as if something inside it is still active. Most people would look at it and assume it's just another health trend, another powdered supplement dressed up to feel important. But that assumption is exactly why you've never heard of what this really is. Because this isn't a product at all. It is one of the most quietly powerful survival systems on Earth, and almost nobody is paying attention to it in the way they should. Not the companies shaping the future of food, not the large agricultural systems controlling supply, and not even most of the people who would benefit from it the most. That becomes a serious problem when the world itself is becoming harder to feed. What's happening right now isn't a dramatic collapse of food systems, but something more subtle and more dangerous. These systems are becoming unstable. Rain doesn't arrive when it's expected, or it comes all at once and destroys crops instead of feeding them. Heat shows up at the wrong time in the growing cycle. Soil begins to lose its strength, and the cost of inputs continues to rise. From the outside, everything still appears functional. Markets still operate. Food is still available. But underneath that surface, the structure is weakening. This is how fragile systems fail, not suddenly, but gradually, until one day the pressure becomes too much and everything shifts at once. In the middle of that instability, there is a tree that behaves very differently from most crops. It continues to function regardless of what changes around it, and that alone should make it important. The tree is called Moringa, and the first thing you notice about it is how unremarkable it looks. It has thin branches, soft leaves, and long, uneven pods that hang without any sense of visual authority. There is nothing about it that signals importance or power, and if you passed by it, you probably wouldn't stop to look. That is exactly what has happened on a global scale. The world has walked past it, ignored it, and underestimated it completely. But the moment you look beyond its appearance, the expectations begin to break. While most crops depend on stable conditions to survive, Moringa operates differently. If you cut it down, it grows back. If you leave it in dry soil, it doesn't die immediately, but instead waits. If you plant it in poor conditions where other crops struggle, it still produces. It doesn't just do this once, it does it repeatedly. Its leaves can be eaten, its pods can be cooked, its seeds can produce oil, and even the leftover material from those seeds can help clarify water. Its foliage can feed animals, and its branches can serve practical purposes in everyday life. Instead of specializing in one function, it adapts across multiple needs, and that difference is far more significant than it appears. Modern agriculture, by contrast, is not built around adaptation. It is built around efficiency. It relies on a small number of crops, a limited set of controlled systems, and a predictable environment that allows everything to function smoothly. When those conditions hold, the system performs incredibly well. However, the moment those conditions begin to shift, the weaknesses become visible. This is where most people misunderstand what's happening. When a system is optimized too tightly, it becomes less flexible. And when flexibility disappears, even small disruptions can create disproportionate consequences. That is the stage the world is entering now. This leads to an obvious but uncomfortable question. If something like Moringa exists and has this level of usefulness, why isn't it widely known or adopted on a global scale? Why hasn't it become one of the dominant crops in the world? The answer has very little to do with its usefulness and everything to do with power. The crops that dominate global systems did not become important simply because they were beneficial. They became important because they were scalable, tradable, and controllable. They could move through large systems, across borders, and into industrial processes. They could be standardized, processed, and sold in predictable ways. That is what gave them influence. Moringa does not fit into that structure. It is too adaptable, too local, and too easy for individuals to grow without depending on centralized systems. It does not require complex infrastructure, and it does not depend on large supply chains. That independence makes it incredibly valuable at a small scale, but it also makes it difficult to integrate into systems that rely on control. And that is where the conflict begins. Most of the modern food system is built around maintaining control over production, distribution, and inputs. Moringa weakens that control because it gives people options, and options reduce dependence. For systems built on dependence, that is a problem. This is also where the misunderstanding deepens. Many people encounter moringa for the first time not as a tree, but as a product. It appears as a powder, a supplement, or a health trend, something packaged and marketed as part of a lifestyle. That framing completely misses the real significance of what it is. Moringa is not important because it can be sold. It is important because it can remain present and functional in environments where other systems begin to fail. That is a fundamentally different type of value. In unstable conditions, the most valuable systems are not the ones that scale the fastest, but the ones that continue working when everything else starts to break down. Moringa operates in that space. It does not dominate entire agricultural systems, but it supports them in critical ways. It exists in backyards, small farms, and the edges of fields, places that are often ignored in large-scale planning, but are essential for everyday survival. That is where its impact becomes most visible. Imagine a period of scarcity, when food becomes harder to access, costs increase, and options begin to shrink. In that situation, having a tree that continues to produce edible leaves repeatedly changes the equation. You do not need to wait for a full growing season or depend on perfect conditions. You can take what you need, and the tree continues to regenerate. That reliability introduces a form of stability that is often missing in larger systems. Survival, in reality, is not built on perfect outcomes, but on consistent, repeatable ones, and that is exactly what Moringa provides. Once you recognize that, a larger pattern begins to emerge. Moringa is not an isolated case, but part of a broader category of overlooked resources. Throughout history, resilient systems have often been replaced by more efficient ones. Diverse crops have been reduced to uniform selections, and local knowledge has been overshadowed by centralized control. These transitions often appear beneficial in the short term because they increase output and simplify management. However, they also reduce the system's ability to adapt when conditions change. Now those conditions are changing more rapidly than before, and the limitations of highly optimized systems are becoming more visible. As that happens, the things that once seemed unimportant begin to regain significance. However, there is a risk in how this rediscovery happens. When systems like Moringa are brought into global attention, they are often transformed into products rather than understood as part of a larger survival strategy. The focus shifts towards selling and scaling rather than learning and adapting, and in that process, the original context is lost. This creates a clear divide in how people interpret what they are seeing. One perspective looks at Moringa and asks how it can be commercialized, how it can be packaged and integrated into markets. Another perspective looks deeper and asks what it reveals about resilience and survival. The second perspective is far more valuable because it recognizes that Moringa itself is not the ultimate solution. No single plant can solve complex problems like hunger, which are influenced by infrastructure, economics, access, and stability. What Moringa does instead is expose how fragile existing systems already are. If a single tree can provide that much value at a household level, then the issue is not the lack of innovation but the lack of resilience built into the system. This realization changes how the future should be approached. Instead of focusing only on increasing efficiency and control, there is a need to build systems that can withstand uncertainty and continue functioning under pressure. These systems will likely look different from what exists today. They will be more local, more diverse, and more adaptable, even if they appear less optimized. In that kind of future, the most valuable resources will not necessarily be the ones that attract the most attention. They will be the ones that continue working quietly and consistently, even when conditions become difficult. Moringa represents that type of resource. It is not defined by hype or visibility, but by its ability to persist and provide value over time. This leads to a broader reconsideration of how value is measured. Modern systems often prioritize scale, visibility, and control, but these factors do not always align with long-term usefulness. In many cases, the most important resources are those that operate independently of large systems and remain reliable under stress. These resources often go unnoticed because they do not fit into dominant narratives of progress and innovation. If a tree like Moringa can exist for generations, providing multiple forms of support without becoming central to global systems, then the real question extends beyond this single example. it raises the possibility that other valuable resources have also been overlooked. Not because they lack importance, but because they do not align with existing structures of power and recognition. In stable conditions, overlooking such resources may not have immediate consequences. However, in a world where instability is increasing, that oversight becomes more significant. The future of food and survival will not be determined solely by new inventions or technological advancements. It will also depend on the ability to recognize and integrate systems that have already proven their resilience over time. Moringa is not a hidden miracle waiting to be discovered. It has always been present, functioning quietly in environments where survival depends on adaptability and consistency. What has been missing is not its usefulness, but the attention required to understand its role. As conditions continue to change, that lack of attention may become increasingly costly. Because in the end, the most important question is not whether Moringa can solve global problems on its own, it is whether we are capable of recognizing value before systems are forced to rely on it.